Story 1. When I was around 11 years old, my family said I would randomly flip out for no reason. We'd be sitting at dinner and my mom told me on more than one occasion I'd throw my silverware across the room and start cursing and wailing at my brother. Completely unprovoked, I'd start beating the shit out of my then 8 and 10-year-old brothers, and one time I even hit my grandma. It got to a point where I'd have to eat by myself. The worst part of it was that I'd have no memory of these outbursts at all. I had no idea why my brothers were afraid of me, why I'd have to eat alone every night, and why everyone seemingly hated me. It was an extremely alienating childhood experience, to say the least, and for a short time, I was suicidal. Not in action, but definitely in my thoughts. My teachers, friends, and other family members couldn't understand what my family was talking about. To them, I was the sweetest, smartest, and humblest kid they'd ever met. I was loved by everyone outside of my home. My mom brought me to a psychologist, a therapist, and at one point, a Catholic priest. She thought I may have shown signs of being possessed. She told them I'd become a different kid in front of their eyes. And because I had no recollection of anything she'd been talking about but seeing the extent of what she was willing to do to get to the bottom of it, I was inclined to believe her. One day with my dad, I went to the movies and fell in the lobby and hit my head. Gave me a nasty concussion. To make a long story short, a CAT scan had been done, and they found out that I had a cyst in my head below the arachnoid of my left temporal lobe. The cyst was the size of a baseball and was growing. My brain was being crushed against the right side of my skull and was causing severe damage to my medulla oblongata. We went to a neurologist at Stony Brook University Hospital who took a closer look at my case, a very bright doctor by the name of Dr. Egnor. This man saved my life. He said that falling and hitting my head was a miracle because I was mere weeks away from dying in my sleep of a hemorrhage, and said I'd need to be in surgery by the end of that week. It was at that point he asked my mom why they hadn't brought me in sooner. She was like, "Well, I'm not a neurologist, so..." And he said, "I'm sure he's been showing signs of something going wrong. Outbursts of anger, memory loss, unexplained nosebleeds, severe depression." I'll never forget the look on my mom's face. Her eyes widened. She turned and looked at me, grabbed my face, and started sobbing uncontrollably. I still get emotional thinking about this. She just kept saying, "I'm sorry, I'm so sorry," over and over. Tears poured down her face. I just looked her in the eyes and said, "It's okay, Mommy, I'm gonna be better soon," with a hopeful bounce in my voice. That was 22 years ago. The doctor saved my life and there were no complications after the surgery. The outbursts had completely stopped, and after only 1 month of recovery, I was back in school and I had gotten on the honor roll for the first time in my life. I was able to fix my relationships with my brothers by being the best brother I could be for them. And for the last 2 years of my grandma's life, I made sure I told her I loved her every day and never said anything even remotely nasty to her. That surgery fixed me in so many ways, and I owe it all to a slip and fall at the movie theater. Story 2. My family has a pretty isolated farm. There are other houses nearby, but are mostly abandoned. I spent a winter break there alone when I was 17. I would be alone Monde de Fry, and my dad and brother would come on the weekends as it was a Christmas school break. I had some meat in a smoker next to my house. It's like a separate shed with a pizza oven where we smoke, dry the meat, and keep the logs and wood for the fireplace in the house. So anyway, it's around 3 a.m. Winter, it's night, and it's been snowing for a few days. The first layer of snow froze and the wind is blowing new snow on top of it. As I'm walking from the house to the smoker, I'm admiring the noise it makes, kind of like pouring sugar in a bowl. I kind of stop and enjoy the sound it makes. I check up on the fire in the smoker, make sure it's out, get some more firewood for the house, and go to bed. I lock the door and go to the house. Still, hear the noise it makes when it hits the surface. Went into the house, dropped the firewood next to the furnace, and went out on the porch to put the ashes from the fire into the bin. And then I hear it. Silence. Complete and utter silence. At first I thought that it stopped snowing, but the snow is still falling the same way it was a minute ago. Immediately I feel something is up. So as I'm turning my head scared, I'm expecting something to happen, and the hairs on my neck and arms have already stood up. Then I hear like a faint song, like a lullaby of a woman singing a baby to sleep. Nothing other than this song can be heard, even though it's fairly quiet and from a distance. Instant there, and I'm frozen knit, moving, and the song is echoing from the woods, but also kinda around the house, so I'm not expecting anyone to jump out, but didn't know where the noise is coming from. I run to the house and lock myself in the bedroom. The house is near the woods, it's been snowing, and it's 3 a.m. Nobody would ever come close to the house, so I'm creeped out and can't go to sleep. I locked myself in the bedroom and stayed there until morning. Nothing happened, and I didn't hear the sound again. When I think of it, the sound stopped when I ran inside. When my dad came a few days later, he spent the weekends with me there and went back to work on Mondays. He just shrugged it off and said, "It may be time to go back home." I went home with him that Monday and never spent a day on my own in that house since. It was a few months later that I found out what happened. The farm is in a small village populated by mostly old people, and some of them have no family and live alone. One old lady went missing that winter, but nobody reported it as she had no family or friends who would notice it. She lived in a small house on the far side of the forest with no electricity. She most likely had a stroke at some point or needed some other sort of help as she went through the woods towards our house. The lights in our house were on, so it's visible at night, so that may be why she came to it, but also as my grandmother was like a village doctor, she may have remembered her and wanted help. So the old woman tried to walk through these woods and couldn't speak, and she fell into a hole, like a dried-up river basin, and got stuck there and died. She was found a few months later in the woods, which are approx. Miles from our house. I'll never forget the sound she made and how it sounded exactly like an old lullaby. Not sure if it was because of the stroke or if I imagined it. I was not okay for some time. Story 3. It was springtime and my boyfriend and I wanted to go for a hike on a semi-popular trail on the edge of town. As we pulled into the parking lot, there was only one other car. It was hidden from the entrance, and it struck me as odd that it wasn't closer to the trailhead, but I brushed it off. We started on the quiet, frosty trail. The pathway was packed with hard, crunchy snow, and as we strolled out of sight of the parking lot, I started hearing echoes of our footsteps. I'm a very scared, anxious person, so at first I thought it was all in my head. But when we stopped abruptly, I heard a shuffling step, delayed and off rhythm coming from the woods beside us. My heart stopped, and I held my breath to listen. I said, "Did you hear that?" My boyfriend hadn't. He said, "It's okay, stop worrying." He had his handgun holstered and he would protect me. Although that never made me feel entirely safe, I said okay. We continued walking, and the echoing footsteps faded into ours, until a twig snapped in the woods beside us. My boyfriend's eyes darted to mine, and I stammered loudly, "We're being followed. There is an animal in the woods following us." But we both knew it wasn't an animal. When animals stalk you, you don't hear them. If you're lucky and downwind, you will smell a bear before you ever see it. And if you hear it, you'll hear the loud huff and grunts that it wants you to warn you away. This was not an animal, and for some reason letting this stalker know that I knew that they were following us seemed like a bad idea, let alone terrifying. I had been followed on the street before, and was the type to avoid eye contact to try to prevent escalation. I know now, bad idea. So I thought, hey, if we can play stupid and get out of here unscathed, I'm all for it. So just like that, we turned back and half ran to our car, watching over our shoulders the entire distance, and it was weird, but there are a lot of weird people in that state, so maybe it was nothing. Almost a month later, a girl my age was kidnapped from that area. When they caught the guy who took her, he confessed to torturing her, brutally murdering her. However, he'd been hunting for a couple to torture and kill for weeks beforehand, like the many couples he'd killed in the past. The news coverage was immense, and the town was obsessed. He was living among us. He could have killed any of us. All of the hype that comes with the capture of a serial killer in a small town. But my blood ran cold when he was interviewed, saying that one of his frequent hunting spots had been the park that we'd been stalked at, and that he almost took a couple, before he noticed that the man was an off-duty cop. Now, my boyfriend was not a cop, but his gun and holster, his work boots, and the way he carries himself could definitely be interpreted that way. Story 4. I was 11, and I recently moved to another city with my family due to my father being in my country's army. We were staying there for a year, and thankfully the army gave us a decent house in a complex built for officials with families. Each house had its own large backyard and was separated from other houses by 12-foot concrete walls. One Sunday, my family went to buy some stuff at the supermarket. My older sister went with them, and my little one was still a baby. so I was going to be alone for a couple of hours. I was okay just playing with my dog, but I remembered that I needed to get my black socks for my school's Monday uniform that resembled a suit and tie. I went to the backyard to get them since they were hanging to dry. At this point, I was getting bored of waiting for my socks, and I said out loud, "I'm bored," only to almost immediately hear a young voice closely say, "Then let's play." The voice was clear but not loud. It didn't feel like it came from in front of me or any of my sides. It was just there. I turned around to see my normally hyperactive golden retriever sitting quietly and staring at me. I looked around very fast, trying to find the source of the voice, but the house to the right was empty and separated by the concrete wall. The house to the left was over 50 feet away, and behind the wall. And my house, there was the long wall with nothing but a steep hill, and a house at the bottom behind it. I ran for dear life and hid in my parents' bedroom under the covers and turned the TV on at max volume until they arrived. I explained to them what happened, and they had to calm me down for the rest of the day. I have no idea what was, and to this day I still cannot put my finger on it. I knew the kids on the house to the left, and it wasn't any of their voices. The house to the right didn't have any kids, as I learned later, and there's no way some kid climbed a hill. Then a 12th wall covered in sharp glass at the top just to say that. Story 5. It was a summer night in Southern California, midnight or so. I was living with my grandparents for the season and taking online courses. For context, my grandparents lived on the edge of a sort of green belt, except it wasn't very green. And there were lots of hungry wild animals who would wander onto the property, so I would step out onto this balcony at night and do my coursework and smoke cigarettes for a few hours, come back in, and go to bed. The balcony was on the second story, but it was right next to a split-level roof. There was about a 3-foot gap between the railing of the balcony and the awning above it, and you could crawl right onto the roof using this gap. Or, at night, when it was pitch black beyond the balcony, things could crawl out of it at you. So here I was, doing what I'd been doing for a month at that point, smoking and reading and writing in the warm night with a lonely light bulb as my only companion. The dark gap between roofs was above me to the right, and it occasionally caught my eye, as voids tend to do. But I'd spent 20 summers at this house and felt completely comfortable, until all of a fucking sudden this insistent prickling began at the nape of my neck. Just below it actually, ringing down my collarbone and into the tops of my shoulder blades even as it ran up my neck. The hand I was using to ash my cigarette froze before I'd even formed the feeling that I was in danger. You know when you involuntarily gulp because something takes you so off guard? This was one of those moments. A second of pure dread. I looked around, stared hard at the gap between walls, stood up slowly and looked some more. There had been no sounds, no vibrations, no nothing. And yet my primal brain was convinced that there was something, that I was being watched. I ignored my primal brain, classic mistake. Sat back down, gingerly pulled my laptop back into my lap, typed slowly, only 2 fingers while I listened for another. Whatever the hell that had been, I didn't light another cigarette. My peripheral was straining to stay on the gap between the walls. Something about it was different. Something about it was dark, my brain said. Just dark. And I didn't see anything, but I felt it and I knew it, and my spine was screaming at me again. Get inside, get inside, get inside. And I slammed my laptop and hopped up and yanked open the sliding glass door, slammed it behind me and threw the lock and ran to the bathroom where I knew a window was open. A window that led to the same stretch of roof that had suddenly become so dangerous for some unknown reason, and jumped up on the toilet to close the damned thing. And just as I slammed this window shut, something slammed down onto the roof on the other side of it. It was heavy. Maybe a raccoon, maybe a man, but it had followed me across the roof to the other side of the house, and it was heavy. I jumped down from the toilet and this time definitely ran to my room, and that fucking thing followed me again. For context, my room was not the room the balcony was off of, and when I got to my room, suddenly the eerie quietude was replaced with pacing above my head. It was not a man. We can't move that fast across roofs. It was not a raccoon. It had about 90 pounds on a raccoon, maybe even more. I heard it pacing in a circle above my bed for at least another minute before I heard my grandma call me from down the hall. I went out to meet her and she asked me what the big crash was. She'd heard it too. So I knew I wasn't crazy. When I went back into my room a few minutes later, the pacing was gone, but I never worked on that balcony again at night. Story 6. As a young kid, I had nightmares of waking up to see my mother hovering over my bed by the window. She just blankly stared down at me and my sister. I'd get so scared, yelling, "Mom, Mom," and she never responded. It knew it was not my mom. When I was older, I told my aunt about it, and she told me they weren't dreams. It was real. My mom would go into our rooms randomly to check on us. She had serious mental health issues that got worse over the years. Occasionally, she would have episodes of anxiety about something happening to us and guard us at night. The traumatic death of her first child apparently triggered obsessive anxiety when we were younger. I now know the whole fucked up backstory and can sympathize with why it would make any parent get to that mental state, but I still shudder when I think of the blank face stare. I still tend to associate the nightmare mom with not being my mom. Story 7. When I was 8, we were on a long holiday, staying with some family in a town called Surat. It's in country Queensland, Australia. I was staying in their son's room who had moved to Brisbane for university. Each night I had the same recurring nightmare of an alien tentacle trying to grab me. After a week, I was terrified of going to sleep, but my parents kept telling me that it was okay. I was just frightened because we were staying somewhere new and that it would be okay. Well, I couldn't get to sleep. I kept watching the clock, waiting for the sun to come up, and terrified of the alien. It was just after 2 a.m. when a large tentacle landed on the bed. I screamed in terror as I felt the tentacle wriggling. I jumped out of bed and kept screaming. My parents, aunt, uncle, and sister ran into the room to find me huddled in the corner screaming. Turns out it was an adult carpet python over 2 meters long, 6'5 foot. Each night it worked its way under a ceiling tile and onto the bed. I still have an Indiana Jones fear of snakes. Why'd it have to be snakes? Tori 8. When I was younger, I'd have these flashes or blurs of people, like cloaked shadowy figures that would be in the corner of your eye. And when you go to look at them, nobody and nothing was there. If I attempted to just not look at them, let them exist, they'd remain. In addition to that, I'd blink and I'd be just somewhere else doing something unrelated, unsure how I got there. Growing up, I sort of just tolerated it and pinned it down to what I believed might be spiritual in nature, a loss of control or whatever. I was young and struggling to make sense of feeling that was out of control and followed by demons. Turns out after seeing a doctor and a few other incidents that stuck out as major to other people, extreme sleep deprivation and long-term suppressed trauma were causing me to hallucinate and suffer from paranoia. This became even scarier for a while because people recalled memories and told stories of things that I have literally zero recollection of, bringing into question previous memories I had of things. The blinking and appearing somewhere else wasn't losing control, but a condition where my brain would, in doctors' watered-down version, overload and disengage the memory-taking part of the brain. It wasn't some spiritual attack, but my brain basically turned off the record button from stress. This was scary because episodes would strike where, according to others, I would get a distant gaze, freeze, go still, or continue what I was doing as if my body was just on autopilot. I'd stare at people completely unaware, only for me to come back into awareness, not recalling the staring part. These episodes would strike at random and had no warning or any indication of how or why. I was terrified to go some places, drive a car in case I had an episode and crashed, etc. Thinking I was being followed by demons and under some spiritual attack made me at least feel special and/or that somebody was in control. Rather than, hey, your brain just shuts off the memory for our engage button sometimes at random, and you really need to get some long-term help because messed up stuff happened to you in your childhood, otherwise you're literally going to go insane. Story 9. When my friends and I initially entered college, we used to chill a lot at my friend's dad's house, who lived out in the country. Late at night, when scanning the horizon, you could see all of the stars. It wasn't like the city, but you could also see a radio tower, perhaps a few miles away. One late fall night, maybe 1 or 2 in the morning, we decided to drive out to this radio tower, just out of curiosity. It was in the middle of a large field with one entrance that happened to be open. We entered from there and drove about 1/4 mile in towards the radio tower. When we got there, we noticed, underneath the radio tower, a rusty beat-up car. The thing looked like it hadn't been driven in years. We pulled to the other side of the tower and just chilled for a little bit, talking about whatever and listening to music. Then one of my friends pointed toward the beat-up car. "Does it look like there's a light in there?" he said. We all stared at the car, and sure enough, emanating behind the dust-covered windows of the car was a dim light. We pretty quickly put our car in drive and started moving out of there. It was a field though, so of course we moved relatively slow. The same friend who pointed out the light noticed that the car started moving along with us, following slowly. It didn't put on its headlights, but the light inside the car seemed to glow brighter. That was the moment that my friend driving screamed, "Fuck it," and hightailed it faster than I'd ever seen. We left the junk car in the dust, literally in this case, and from that day we have always referred to this story as the ghost car story. Did we really believe in ghosts? Probably not, but paranormal is better than whatever else it could have been. Come to find out, a few years later, that field was regularly being monitored by the local sheriff's office for big drug deals that apparently went down there. Had we stuck around any longer that night than we did, we could have legitimately been killed. This was also in the era that we watched a lot of Breaking Bad, so in retrospect, it seemed to us like that could have very much been a likely outcome from that night. Luckily, we're all good and nothing bad ever came of it for any of us.
The end. Thanks for watching. Don't leave before leaving a like to this video. Also hit the subscribe button to support my work. And as always, have a horrific nightmare, my dear.